first of all, what's your assessment of the party's performance and the overall performance of the opposition?
Well, as everyone has noted, this was certainly a better performance for opposition parties compared to the previous election in 2015. And for the Workers' Party in particular, we're very pleased with the vote of confidence from the voters, which enabled us to win 10 seats, making a breakthrough in a new group representation constituency called Sengkang GRC. I think overall this election was quite a different one from previous ones being held in a pandemic. The modes of campaigning were different. And I think one of perhaps the questions on voters' minds was the timing of the election. We do know from various polls before that there was a sense that the majority of Singaporeans felt that the government should focus on controlling and handling the pandemic rather than to have an election at this time, because its term was still able to run until April next year. So there were various factors at play, I believe. But overall, I mean, we have gained 10 seats, but a reality check, really, it's 10 out of 93. In many countries in the world, that would be considered a marginalized presence in parliament.
Sylvia, do you think the younger voters tipped the balance for the opposition this time round?
It's hard to say until we look in more detail at the polling results by districts. But of course, in the new GRC that we mentioned, Sengkang GRC, it consists of largely new public housing where there is a large proportion of younger voters below the age of 45. And certainly when we started the campaign there, we were not expecting to win that GRC, but it looks like during the campaign, the momentum shifted and because our team in that area matched the profile of the voters, meaning that the oldest candidate was 44, the youngest was 26. They were all parents of young children, which was basically the profile of a large number of voters in that area. So nationwide, I'm not able to say right now whether the younger voters tipped the balance overall, but I think certainly in that particular constituency, it made a big difference.
Do you think the younger voters will play a larger role in upcoming elections? Is there a sense when you walk the ground?
Not so much from walking the ground per se, because younger voters also, they tend to make their views known through social media and other means. But certainly, I think their vision of Singapore is probably different from the older voters to some extent. And the way they see politics too, in my own experience, is quite different. I mean, the older voters, perhaps they're used to more hardline combative campaigning, and in previous elections, we've always seen some element of character assassination from the ruling party, which they did this time as well. But it appears that attempt backfired, especially among the younger voters. So I think it bodes well for the future. We want a Singapore which is, inclusive of different views. We have to find a way to be more accepting and to talk through our differences rather than to just, kill the message bearer.
Speaking of the future, Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat put in a pretty disappointing performance, some say, at about 53% of the votes. What does it say about his leadership? Is there anything to read from that?
Well, the background was that, as far as we know anyway, he was, in a way, asked to defend East Coast GRC, Group Representation Constituency, quite late, probably not many days before nomination day. I mean, I don't have the inside information, but it appeared to be that way because the announcement was made by his surprise presence at the nomination center to contest East Coast. So I do not know how much time he and his team had to really work out a strategy. Certainly from observing what happened at the nomination center when his message to the voters was cut off because there was insufficient time. and so on. It appeared as if the campaign wasn't well prepared. So I'm not sure how much of that is really attributed to him per se or to the party as a whole, but this is something that in the coming, I think, weeks and months, more will be clear.
The Workers' Party will have 10 out of the 93 seats in Parliament. What will be the party's priorities? What policies will you be pushing for?
Well, we have, during the campaign, highlighted certain things that we think are important going forward. I believe one of the topics will be whether the economic model that Singapore has relied on successfully to date has to change. One of the aspects of this is, to date we have a heavy reliance on foreign labor, particularly low-wage workers, to do a lot of our, I would say, hard work, such as in construction. And this, of course, has kept our productivity rather low. And in the COVID pandemic, there was a big, and still is a big, outbreak of COVID-19 cases in densely populated dormitories. So certainly the economic model to take Singapore into the future will be one of the topics which is important to us. Second aspect would be, I think, how our government budgets are financed, because the government has already made it clear that there is an intention to raise our goods and services tax by 2% sometime between 2021 and 2025. But of course, we know all this will raise the standard of living, cost of living for everyone. And we do find that there are other possible sources of revenue that could be tapped on, which would perhaps obviate the need to raise GST, such as, looking at the contribution from the return from investments, perhaps land sales and so on. But finally, at a broader level, I think we want to have a big discussion at the appropriate time about how we can be a more open society, how press freedom can be better than our current ranking of 158th in the world. And in that sense, pay attention to the intangible aspects that would make Singapore a stronger, better society.
That's also the issue of foreign workers, immigration, which has been pretty emotional for Singapore. Realistically, what can the government do without impinging on the country's competitiveness?
Well, this is something that I think is not an easy question to answer, but I think Singaporeans are concerned about population size, given the fact that we are an island of 700 square kilometers. So the quality of life for Singaporeans is very important. We certainly don't want our public infrastructure, our healthcare facilities, our public transport to be overrun. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, productivity will be one of the key issues going forward, likely innovation as well. We probably need to raise our game in that sense and not rely on inputs to raise GDP.
Sylvia, we talked about how the opposition has come a long way, from no opposition to a representation of 1, from 5 to now 10. Realistically, though, do you envision a day when the opposition can provide a true alternative to the PAP?
Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, and I know this personally too, because, the figures that you mentioned, I walked through it with the Workers' Party when I joined it 20 years ago. And a lot of how Singapore moves forward, whether the ruling party, will have a smaller majority in Parliament in the next few elections, or whether it deteriorates to the point where the voters feel that another party is able to take over. This is all in the horizon, not so immediate, I think. What our elections have shown is that Singaporean voters in general take their vote very seriously. I don't think they will, in general, vote just as a protest, but they will also look at what is at stake, who is providing the alternative, and whether they think they can accept that person as their member of parliament. So this is a question for Singaporeans to decide. And I do not think it will come in a big bang, but it will come more incrementally, I believe.
We talk about how Singaporeans want change. Will that change come with Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat taking the helm, what kind of leadership do you think he will provide? How different will it be from Lee Hsien Loong? Your own take on it.
Well, I actually know DPM Heng personally, although not very well, because he was a police scholar and I was a police officer in the past. In fact, he headed the recruitment interview where I was recruited into the police force. And by all accounts, I think everyone agrees that he's a very decent man. But I suppose in a sense, he might be more comfortable crunching numbers and so on. I mean, charismatic is not a term that we would ascribe to him, but that doesn't mean, of course, that a prime minister has to be, charismatic in a firebrand manner. I mean, he can show competence in other ways. So I do believe that as and when DPM Heng becomes PM, he will have his own style of leadership. He will have a team with him, so it's not just him alone. And I mean, collectively, if the team is able to move forward and convince Singaporeans that they are the party most capable of improving their standard of life, then they probably can, in that sense, make the necessary adjustments to maintain voter confidence.